Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this episode of Developing Classical Thinkers. My name is Winston Brady, and I'm the host of DCT. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Robert Pondiscio, who is the Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and is an affiliate of AEI's James Q. Wilson program in K-12 Education Studies, where he focuses on K-12 education, curriculum teaching, school choice, and charter schooling. Robert, thank you so much for being on Developing Classical Thinkers today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation and your insights into the state of K-12 education.
Thanks, Winston. Appreciate the opportunity.
So, Robert, can you tell us about your background and your current role at AEI?
My current role is Senior Fellow, as you mentioned, which I think literally means old man. So that's what I am at AEI. My background in education belies the fact that I'm an AEI scholar. I always feel the need to make air quotes when someone calls me a scholar because my own educational path was impressionistic, I guess you'd say. I was, as a student myself back in the day, shortly after the earth cooled, I was a B student on my best days, and I was not someone who was, these stories you hear about teachers like, oh, I knew I was going to be a teacher at age 7 because I, used to line my stuffed animals up on my bed and play teacher. Like, no, I was not that kid. I was a mid-career switcher, so I had a whole other life in the news and magazine industry. I worked for Time Magazine back in the day and Business Week. And then in what in my more candid moments, refer to as a mid-career impulse purchase, I signed up for a program in New York City that was called, it still is, I think, called the New York City Teaching Fellows. It was designed to get mid-career folks to give 2 years to the public schools. And I'd been involved for a long time in not-for-profit work in the South Bronx in my spare time. I was a board member of an organization that kind of reinvented itself, putting education at the center of its services. One thing kept leading to another, and it was also, it was right after 9/11, frankly, in New York City, when a lot of us were thinking, we should be doing a little bit to give back. Not with any great amount of forethought, I signed up or applied for this program, the New York City Teaching Fellows, and it was a laborious process. But I remember at one point thinking, if they're dumb enough to accept me, I'm dumb enough to take it, and they did, and I did, and I ended up teaching at a low-performing public school in the South Bronx. That was a deliberate choice because I'd been involved in that neighborhood. And I was, signed up for 2 years, stayed for 5. The long story short, Winston, is that I never expected to do this as a permanent career. This was going to be a 2-year mid-career public service stint that just has never ended. I never went back to the media business. Got interested in issues of curriculum and instruction, which we can talk about this if you like. But in my mind, the education reform movement kind of missed the boat by focusing on policies, as it were, as opposed to practice. So, one thing led to another, and now I'm, almost 25 years into this work, and we'll do it until I'm done working.
And I think that's really fascinating about your background, because a lot of scholars, air quotes, or policy analysts, air quotes, and so on, they don't always have a practical experience teaching actual students, especially in elementary school.
Yeah.
I mean, what grades did you teach?
5th grade. And to set the scene for you, it was the New York City school system is, obviously by far the largest school district or school system in the country, but it's broken into nearly 36 community school districts. So the South Bronx, where I taught, Mott Haven, is what they call District 7. And it was, and still is, to my knowledge, the lowest scoring community school district in the city of New York. And my school, PS 277, was, and I think still is, the lowest scoring school in that district. So, I mean, I say that just to kind of, set the scene for what a jarring transition that can be, going from, the fairly educated world of magazine publishing and journalism into a setting that is literally the worst of the worst, the lowest performing school in the lowest performing district. So it is a jarring transition. But look, to your point about folks in the policy world, I always say this, I never want to be the guy who waves the bloody shirt, right, and says, well, unless you've been a teacher, you can't possibly understand. Because often, that kind of thinking is used to create an oppositional relationship between practice and policy. If I have anything to add to this work and this conversation, is that I kind of stand in the gap there between practice and policy. And I'm the guy who can say with some credibility, I hope, to policymakers, hey, let me explain to you how this, brilliant, policy that you're crafting, let me explain to you what this is going to look like when it arrives in the classroom. And I hope I have the credibility to say to teachers, yeah, look, it'd be lovely if you could just say, trust me and send more money. But it doesn't work that way. We do this work in a public policy environment. There, but for the largesse of the taxpayer go we. So we don't have the luxury to just kind of shut our door and do what we want. We have to be accountable. So, and again, I'm not suggesting this is unique, but it is remarkable to me, even 20 into this work, how siloed it can be. How like practice people don't think about the policy ramifications of what they're doing, and policymakers are, assume that they pull a lever here and things change the next day in schools across their districts and states, and that doesn't happen either.
Right. So what was the biggest challenge that you found working in an elementary school? Like, what's the biggest thing that you saw that maybe other people don't see, that aren't like in the classroom pretty regularly? Maybe they don't have kids, or, they're only looking at it from like a policy sort of angle.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. One, the thing that nobody ever talks about, and it's rock bottom basic, but it affects the life of every teacher, especially those who work in high needs communities, is classroom management and behavior. Now, we love to talk about curriculum and reading and math and whatnot. But at the end of the day, if a teacher is unsuccessful in getting 20 or 30 kids to sit up and pay attention, if they can't run their classroom correctly, or there's chronic behavior problems, then nothing good happens. So when we talk about teacher retention at the risk of getting overly specific, what are the policy fixes? Higher pay, more respect for teachers. And often it's more basic than that. It's like, no teacher, the conditions, it's hard for teachers to run their classrooms because of the rampant behavior problems and whatnot, especially since COVID. I mean, some significant damage was done in terms of just losing the habit of schooling. When you disrupt kids' routines for, all or parts of 3 school years, you can't pretend that hasn't had a material effect, including, among very young children, elementary school kids, who just never developed the habit of schooling. So that's a pretty serious problem right there.
What were your rules in the classroom as far as like managing a large body of students? Like, what were your top 3 rules?
I had a lot, and boy, this is another thing, man. We could talk about this forever, Winston. Just the lack of practical guidance you get as a new teacher from your ed school and your professional development. Just kind of homilies, as I like to say in education, that just don't translate. Like, the best example, being like, oh, you should collaborate with your students in coming up with your classroom rules, which, because then they'll be invested in them. Just no, just doesn't work that way. I've told the story a couple times over the years of one of my assistant principals who one day described me as, quote, an authoritarian teacher, thinking, I assume, that she was insulting me. I said, thank you. Sue me, but I have this idea that I'm the adult in the room. I'm there for a reason. I'm not going to be the guide on the side. I will be the sage on the stage. Thanks very much. I'm going to have pretty strict rules of how you conduct yourself in my classroom. And yes, I'm going to enforce them. And if that makes me, unholy in your eyes, well, okay. But that's the way it's going to be in Mr. P's classroom, and I have no regrets about that.
No, and that's really key, because students like learn better when they're in an environment that's safe and that's orderly. Your discipline and your rigor, that's really there to help the students for the students to succeed. It's a lot like the trellis that the grapevine is growing on. You really need that sort of structure in order to support really good, really positive student outcomes. That's
really well said. Yeah, no, I was having this exact conversation with a classical teacher this morning who was, as I like to say, a refugee teacher. She left a public school setting in Colorado and is now teaching at a high-performing classical charter school there. And that's exactly how she describes it as well. You know, the transition from being the guide on the side to the sage on the sage on the stage. And especially when you're dealing with, you know, not just elementary school students, but in this young lady's instance, early elementary school students. Of course, kids, they want guidelines. They want to know how to conduct themselves. It is not a straitjacket. It is. I love your analogy. It's a trellis. It's a scaffold. It's like this is how we do things around here, so that everybody can learn.
Well, and you've written a number of books, Robert, but one in particular caught my eye: How the Other Half Learns, Quality, Excellence in the Battle Over School Choice. And that seemed to turn current debates on like DEI, equity and inclusion and the like, fairness in education on its head. Can you tell our audience more about that particular book? You know, themes, inspiration,
Yeah,
message, goals, and the like?
sure. There's a astonishingly high-performing charter school network that is entirely in the city of New York. It's called Success Academy. It's run by a woman named Eva Moskowitz. And when I say extraordinarily high-performing, I mean it were a standalone school district in the state of New York, and is large enough to be, they have, you know, well north of 50 schools, all of them in New York City. If they were a standalone district, they would be by a wide margin the highest performing school district in the entire state of New York, with a predominantly low income black and brown student population. So for years, these schools were an object of fascination among those of us who were, you know, in the policy world, because they were just killing it, right? I mean, their scores were just through the roof. I haven't updated the data lately, but you know, at the time I wrote this book, I remember realizing that you know, the lowest performing of their 50 odd schools had 85% of kids passing their ELA tests. And again, you know, disadvantaged kids of color. Their lowest performing school out of those 50 had like 90% of kids passing the math test. So the conceit of this book was I wanted to just figure out how they were doing it. So you know, it took me a while to talk Eva Moskowitz into it, but I talked her into allowing me to embed in one of her schools for an entire school year. And interestingly enough, the school was in the South Bronx, the very same neighborhood I was describing a moment ago. The school was literally across the street from where I'd been a student teacher, and you know, 4 or 5 blocks away from where I taught fifth grade. And it was astonishing and eye-opening. I mean, if I'm being really honest, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, how do you think they're getting these otherworldly results? I would have probably said to you, well, they've got to be cheating, you know, because it's just not possible to get these kinds of results. And it's complicated in terms of how they, you know, come up with their student population. But basically, most of the coverage of this rather astonishing school district, I just found missed the mark. You know, they weren't creaming students, for example. But it had an extraordinary and has an extraordinary school culture. And I say this as somebody who thinks of himself as a curriculum and instruction guy. So I walked into that school and that network, assuming I'd write a book about curriculum and instruction, because you know that to me is, you know, is where the rubber meets the road. And I surprised myself by almost accidentally writing a book about school culture, because I think that's what made the difference at the end of the day. In other words, they made some curriculum and instruction decisions that were not what I would make. And I've got some, you know, fairly well-defined views on curriculum and instruction, good, better, and best, as it were. But the school culture was the thing that made it all work. And to be fair, I'm not going to call it selective admissions because it wasn't that, but it was a muscular adult culture, both for teachers and for parents. They made prodigious demands on parents. And if there was news out of the book, it was this hiding in plain sight way in which they kind of set expectations for parents and then put in front of them what, you know, to be candid, amounts to sort of a series of non-trivial hurdles in front of parents. In other words, it wasn't so the conventional wisdom about Success Academy was, hey, and this is the conventional wisdom among charter advocates in general. Hey, the only difference is the door the kid goes into in the morning. They go into a charter school, they get a good outcome. They go into a public school, they get a bad outcome. Well, it's more complicated than that in general with charter schools, and in specific with Success Academy, where they, yes, you're admitted by lottery, but then you come to a welcome meeting where they say, this is what we stand for and this is what we will not stand for. And they mean it. And then you have to come to a uniform fitting and fill out paperwork and meet the teachers. And then they make a lot of demands on parents, read with your kids, log books, etc. And it's just dishonest to say that it doesn't scare away, frankly, or become unmanageable for some number of parents. So what you end up seeing is a disproportionate share of families who are families, married, employed, religious, ambitious for their kids, the kind of families that frankly would have been outliers in my old school are the dominant. They're overrepresented in places like Success Academy. And people will look at that and say, "Ha, see, we told you there was something unholy going on." It's like, wait a minute, why is that unholy? In other words, my daughter went to private school, end to end. At no point did anybody ever accuse me and my wife of robbing the public school system of the resource that was our child. So along comes an Eva Moskowitz and functionally creates the same opportunity for low-income families of color in places like, the South Bronx and Harlem and whatnot. And now it's a crisis. And now we have to debate whether or not this is fair. And so that's why the book was called How the Other Half Learns, because of that. I wanted the reader to have to confront their own hypocrisy, frankly, over this. It's not controversial. If you are white and well off in this country, you have every opportunity to educate your child either by paying private school tuition, moving to a more affluent neighborhood, and nobody says boo. And if somebody creates within the structure we have a similar opportunity for disadvantaged families, now it's something we need to debate. Why is that? So even though they don't do things that they don't necessarily follow curriculum or instructional models that I would choose. I found it very, very difficult to find fault with it. And in fact, I think this is one of the reasons I'm a choice person, because I have complete and perfect choice for my child. That's what I want you and everyone to have for their child.
And I think that very much fits in line with like our views of American freedom, right? That the parent should really be able to choose the best educational school, the best option, the best choice for their child. What about their culture, though? There's a great quote from Peter Drucker that at the end of the day, like culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So the things that everybody's used to doing pretty regular basis. So what was their culture like? When students showed up in the morning, what was the typical
it's
school
hard
day
to
like?
describe. It's hard to describe economically, but I mean, I'll answer that question in the form of an anecdote.
Yeah.
When I was a public school teacher at this low performing school in the South Bronx, and I already told you, how we were taught, collaborate with your kids on the rules. It resulted in an unmanageable system for kids. In other words, the rules were simply different in my classroom, in Ms. Kelly's classroom, and Mrs. Jones's classrooms, in the cafeteria, in the gym. And I remember one day in my frustration saying, you know what? I just want there to be one set of rules in this building. And they don't have to be mine. I just want them clear. I want them to know I want to know what they are, and I want my students to know what they are so they don't change from place to place. Well, that's exactly what you see at a Success Academy every classroom, every school feels like every other one. There's no, questioning about, what the merits and demerit system in my room versus your room, et cetera. And this does place a heavy lift on the teachers, because they, we're all different, right? You might be more lenient, I might be more strict, et cetera. But, if you're going to teach in a place like that, then not only do you have to understand, the expectations for student conduct, you have to enforce them, as it were, and do so rigorously, because otherwise you're sending a mixed signal to students. So in a way, I would argue that that's the real power is school culture. I remember actually when I was writing the book, and I started realizing how much I was focused on the school culture and the effect that it had on students of kind of galvanizing them and getting aligning them with one another and with all the adults in the building. I remember calling a friend of mine, Patrick Wolf, who's a professor at the University of Arkansas, and he saying to me, well, you must be familiar with George Akerlof's work, right? And I confessed that I did not know who George Akerlof was, and I should because he's a Nobel Prize winner, and his wife is Janet Yellen, the former, Fed chairman. So it's not like he's an obscure figure. But I started reading some of his work about, and I'm not an economist, so I will summarize it badly, but he's a behavioral economist, and his big insight when he was writing about schools was that kids accommodate themselves to the culture. In other words, children want to fit in. So if you control the culture, so to speak, they will, then you control the outcome. And I think I said this in the book. I mean, Success Academy is a clear manifestation of Akerlof's work. I mean, there it was, right there. They really controlled the culture and kids because they want to fit in. So, in other words, if you create a school culture where every child is successful, where every child is, schooly, as it were, where they take their schoolwork seriously, where, we all get good grades on our tests because that's who we are, that's what we do, then kids who want to fit in will accommodate themselves to that. And that's exactly what you see. It's not so for example, a child who was scoring a level 3 or a level 4, which are the highest grades in the New York State tests in reading and math, that kid was an outlier in my old school. In at Success Academy, that's every kid, So it just becomes a norm. It becomes an expectation, and at the end of the day, I think that's the most powerful thing about what they're doing. And I wrote at the end of the book about this, like whether you agree or disagree, whether or not this is your favorite flavor, just imagine for a moment what it's like to be a student, from the South Bronx or a similar disadvantaged neighborhood where you have no reason to expect, or your family has no reason to expect, this kind of relationship with a thing called a school. I mean, schools, for generations in high poverty neighborhoods have been where dreams and ambition go to die. So that school is where you go to realize how little is thought of you, how little is expected of you, where your horizons get narrow. And now imagine that you are, a 10-year-old black or brown child in a Success Academy where you go home thinking, no, I'm good at school, and all my friends are good at school, and my teachers believe in me, and they call me every night to check in, to see how I'm doing on the practice tests, etc. You can say whatever you want about Eva Moskowitz and Success Academy, but that's astonishing, right? To have that kind of to cultivate that kind of relationship between low-income kids of color who have been nothing but failed by American education for generations, and it just transforms their relationship with education, with this thing called a school. And I don't care what you think about, Eva Moskowitz or Success Academy. That's powerful.
Yeah, you can't argue with the results if they're producing like so many kids that are rising to such high expectations. And I think that's, as you were talking, it just kept going through my mind that students rise to the standard that you set for them. And so you should have, high expectations, but positively reinforce them day in and day out. And if the school isn't doing that, like the kids are going to float down to, a very, subset series of outcomes. The experience that you had at that local public school in the Bronx versus Success Academy must have been night and day. Let the kids figure out for themselves
it really
what the rules are, what kind of culture they want to create versus like, this is just what excellence looks like.
No, that's exactly right. And this is why, the longer I go on in this work and to bring this to your work at Thales Academy, the more enamored I am of the classical education movement because it is unabashedly about excellence, right? It's unabashedly about, no. There's history and tradition and character and we're the grown-ups, and we are going to, invite you in. But this is not Deweyism. This is not progressive education. This is not student-centered anything. This is you are being invited into, membership, among sophisticated, educated people, so you can be one of us.
Well, and I'd love to go back to that criteria that you presented a few moments ago, in terms of curriculum and looking at it as good, better, and best. I mean, what kind of curriculum would you recommend
Yeah.
for, just a private school, a charter school that's going to be the best that they can be?
Yeah, I mean, look, interestingly enough, I don't think the most interesting thing to know about a school is public, private, charter. I think the most interesting thing to know about a school is its curriculum. I feel like I know nothing about a school if all I know is its governance model. I feel like I know it better if I know its curriculum. Look, I've made no secret about this over the years. I am an unabashed, not just fan, but disciple of E.D. Hirsch Jr. and his vision of core knowledge. And this also, Winston, is born of my experience teaching in the South Bronx, where, for those of us who have heard, the excellent Emily Hanford podcast, Hard Words and Sold a Story, about, our failures in teaching reading over the years. One of the, the villains, as it were, of that excellent series is a woman named Lucy Calkins, who was the pioneer of the Teachers College Readers and Writers Workshop. Well, New York City was dominated by this model for decades. And my school was a Lucy Calkins Teachers College demonstration school. So that's what I was brought up in, as it were. And I've kind of described it over the years as, because again, I was a mid-career switcher, so I had not been in elementary school since I'd been an elementary school student. I was walking in at nearly age 40. And I remember thinking, this workshop model, student-centered, kids get to read what they like, et cetera, strategies, reading skills and strategies. I don't remember any of this when I was a kid. In fact, I don't remember any explicit instruction in reading whatsoever, after first or second grade. Well, reading instruction never ended in my school and those that followed that model. That's all we did is reading and math and nothing else. And it just didn't resemble any instructional model I recalled. And then I stumbled upon Hirsch's work, and needless to say, I found it on my own. It was, not something that was a part of my training or professional development. And it just hit me like a bomb. I've said this so many times over the years. It was as if Don Hirsch, E.D. Hirsch Jr., had been standing in my classroom and saw what I saw every day. Kids who could decode, read the words, in front of them, but struggled with comprehension. And where, the constructivists, the Lucy Calkins of the world would say, well, that's because they're not engaged. That's because the curriculum doesn't reflect their interests and their culture, their history, and the facts of their life. A Hirsch would say, no, it's background knowledge. It's vocabulary. It's because, in order to read with comprehension, you need to know a little bit about the subject that you're reading about, and sometimes a lot about that subject. And therefore, Hirsch would say, the curriculum needs to be broad and deep, and it has to have, art and music and history and science and geography and civics, where, the constructivists will say, well, it can only have those things if the kids are interested in those things. So it should be no surprise to anyone that kids, under those circumstances, like in my old school, appear to be quite strong readers when reading about topics that they know well. But when you put something in front of them, like in a standardized test about a subject they don't know well, suddenly it's as if they can't read at all. Their comprehension falls apart. Well, Calkins' explanation would be, well, they're bored. It's not engaging. Hirsch's explanation would be, they don't have the background knowledge. And to be blunt, he's right and she's wrong. So this is a really long-winded way of saying, what should the curriculum be? It should be the broadest curriculum possible. I don't think this analogy is unique to me or original to me, but I've counseled for years where for example, the way I was taught, the curriculum was all mirrors and no windows. In other words, the kids were exclusively reading about topics they chose themselves that they were interested in, And ever since encountering Hirsch's work, I counsel just the opposite. No, the curriculum should be, oh, a few mirrors are okay, but it should be mostly directing kids' attention out the window. Exposing them to the richness of human experience and the intriguing things that they can learn. Not just saying, hey, you have everything you need inside of your hat, and all you need to do is, practice these, or just be engaged by your reading about your own interests. It's the analogy I often use. It's like going to the gym and thinking, well, I don't like leg day, but I like working out my arms, so I'm just going to do arms. You don't end up looking like Popeye. You end up your general fitness suffers because you're not getting an overall workout. Well, you need an overall mental workout as well. What's my favorite curriculum? It's E.D. Hirsch and core knowledge specifically, but beyond that, because there's more of them now. It's an approach to education that says the world is fascinating, and we are going to be your guides to it, and we're going to make sure that, from one end of your education to the next, you are exposed. Again, why do I love classical? To the best that has been thought and written and said.
And I wrote here, it's something that touches on every aspect of human endeavor. That in like with the school culture, I mean, really, it's a commitment. Like, these things are the best. We want to take you through the best because we want you to be your best. It's more of like a mentality, right? Like, you're trying to present the very best of what has been taught, what has been thought, to inspire students to maybe take up some cause, greater than themselves, to attempt something really noble and worthy. Yeah. And you're putting examples in front of students where men, women did those very noble things.
Yeah, and what a blessing too, right? To be a child in the year 2025 and to have the benefit of 5,000 or more years of human experience, all leading up to this moment, and you get to take it all in. As opposed to thinking, oh, that's all that, dead white guy stuff or whatever. You're the most interesting person in the room. This is all about you. I mean, not only is that solipsistic, it's just wrong, and it's also it's impoverishing, right? I mean, to the hubris to think that what went before you is not just uninteresting but unworthy of your time and attention is just impossibly arrogant. So continue doing what you're doing, and to all classical educators listening to our conversation, man, what a blessing that you have to be your students' guides to all this.
Robert, I know you know these statistics better than anyone. But every year, when the nation's report card comes out, it just seems like our math and reading scores continue to decline further and further. There's a model of instruction that we at Thales really love called direct instruction. And I know that you've organized some webinars, teaching opportunities at AEI. Can you talk to our listeners about the efficacy of direct instruction when it comes to teaching phonics and reading and literacy?
And in fact, apropos of direct instruction, my last visit to Thales less than a year ago was at the invitation and in the company of Kurt Engelmann, Siegfried Engelmann's son, which was fantastic. I was not brought up in direct instruction, and very much like my experience with core knowledge, it was something I had to stumble upon myself. But the data speaks volumes. I've actually written somewhat sarcastically about this over the years. I remember writing a piece comparing direct instruction to Rodney Dangerfield, which is a comedian that maybe younger listeners don't remember. He was, or maybe they remember him from the movie Caddyshack. But his catch line was, "I don't get no respect." Direct instruction is the Rodney Dangerfield of curriculum. It gets no respect, and the joke is all it does is work. But we've got 50 years of data going back to from Project Follow Through that just show that it not only outperforms other curricular models, but it does so by a wide margin. And but it's not, it is, I think, incorrectly viewed as rigid, hierarchical, stultifying, unengaging. Name your pejorative, like drill and kill. But it sure is effective, right? And by the way, I think it's none of those things. My colleagues who are direct instruction experts and former teachers in it and current teachers insist that it is actually harder to teach with direct instruction, not more, not easier. In other words, it's not robotic. It is not McTeaching. You're not, just reading from a script. And the analogy I've often used is, anybody who's inclined to think that this is makes a teacher less than. Well, do you think, Yo-Yo Ma is less than because he didn't write the Brandenburg concertos? All he does is play. Or do you think that a Shakespearean actor is, not a great actor because, well, you didn't write Hamlet. You're just saying the words. It's just odd to me that teachers alone among professions, and if you prefer artists, are expected to be the authors of the music and or the playwright, the poet, etc. And it's just too much. It makes the job almost impossible to do well. But look, no, direct instruction has nothing to apologize for. It has been proven effective for decades. And so it is an exceptional model, and it's one that more schools should follow.
Do you see a kind of corollary in that classical education, once a student can read, they ought to read the very best books? I mean, do you see them as naturally going together? Sometimes
Yeah.
we almost have to sell, that direct instruction, classical education, these things necessarily go together in a really beautiful and profound way. But do you see them as really complementing each other in that way?
Oh, no question. And add core knowledge to that as well. Direct instruction. There's a lot of core knowledge schools that are core knowledge in the elementary level and then are classical in middle and upper grades. By the way, in discussing what core knowledge is, I think I buried the lead somewhat. Hirsch's work is really, it's not about canon making, it's a curatorial effort. And what I mean by that is he kind of firmly established in his own research decades ago what I saw in my class from the South Bronx, that language proficiency really is a function of background knowledge. In other words, if I'm going to boil Hirsch's work down into a sentence, it's writers and speakers make assumptions about what listeners and readers know. And when those assumptions are correct, comprehension, whether it's oral or written comprehension, tends to be effortless and fluid. And when it's not, comprehension breaks down. And I can go into more detail about that, but just take my word for it for now. Well, that implies, right, that there is a certain body of knowledge that literate people know and assume that you know as well. Idiomatic language. So in order, and again, I speak as somebody whose entire career has been focused on the educational outcomes of disadvantaged kids. So for those kids in particular, this is acute. If you make the assumption, I promise I'm going to answer your question, Winston, but I'm being a bit discursive here, but please bear with me. If you make decisions on behalf of that kid, oh, you don't need to know Greek mythology. Oh, you don't need to understand, biblical references, not in a religious sense, but just in terms of the idioms that come from the Bible, Good Samaritan, etc., or Achilles' heel in Greek myths. If you make the decision, oh, that's hegemonic, that's Eurocentric, you don't need to know that. Well, literate people assume that will know that. So when your language is peppered with those illusions, because English is peppered with those illusions, you're literally imposing a form of illiteracy on someone else's child. So how dare we do that? So all of this, in my mind, does work together. To your very good point, direct instruction for decoding, core knowledge to build, or another knowledge-rich curriculum. To build that essential background knowledge and vocabulary. Classical education to invite children into the great conversation, to reach the educated heights of which they're capable. all of them just work beautifully together. And in my mind, I'm not somebody who wants to impose my priors on other people's children, but once you understand one, how language proficiency works, well then decoding and background knowledge become non-negotiables. You're disadvantaging them if you don't provide for that. And classical, to my mind, is like varsity academics, so to speak. Like this is what's going to take you, raise you up, and allow you to take your place in thousands of years of human education and tradition.
I think that's a profound point. Like, if we don't teach students like the background knowledge needed to understand really valuable works of literature, we're offering them a profound disservice. If I were a calculus teacher, which I'm not, that's very hard. That would be very hard for me. But if somebody asked me why I would need to learn calculus, I would respond back, well, I don't know what you're going to be when you grow up. Like, you could be some amazing, rocket scientist, engineer, or perhaps in high finance, which uses a lot of the same principles as rocketry. Like, I don't know what you're going to be when you grow up, so you might need this. But if I don't teach it to them, I'm holding them back.
Hold as many doors open for as long as you can. And that's why, and again, I don't want to be overly critical, because I think a lot of these impulses come from a good place, as people like to say. But whenever I hear, this kind of talk about, oh, we're going to decolonize the curriculum, I want to say kind of bluntly, who the hell do you think you are? Like, to make these assumptions about what's in a child's best interest, and to absent them from these conversations and from these opportunities. In other words, I get that you think you're doing right by this kid, but once you understand the way language proficiency works at the kind of molecular level, anytime you make a decision on behalf of a child, hey, I know this, but you don't need to. Again, you're kind of imposing a form of illiteracy on kids. And again, I don't want to be harsh and judgmental, but this is why so much of the work that I do is simply trying to explain to professional educators. Let me walk you through what language proficiency looks like. I don't want to be the one who's going to tell you teach this, don't teach this. But once you understand why background knowledge matters, why vocabulary, where vocabulary growth comes from, well, now you've got high stakes decisions to make, because all of us in this work, right? Even if we've got 13 years times 180 days times 7 hours a day, that's still not enough to give kids everything that they need to be, proficient, as it were. That's why, going back to what I was saying a moment ago, why I always preach, windows as opposed to mirrors, because that's what educated people do, right? You want to cultivate that mindset of, to be an educated, literate person is to constantly be paying attention, to be constantly learning, to be constantly challenging yourself with the things that you don't know. And oh, by the way, the world's a fascinating place. Let's not direct kids' attention to their navels. I make a joke that will resonate with classical educators. I always say, the unlived life is not worth examining. So let's expose kids to something beyond their current narrow field of view.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to high expectations positively reinforced. What about for parents? Like, let's say they've had their kids in a public school that has not served their students' needs well. What advice would you give to those parents who are trying to, teach their students to read, complete arithmetic? Like, what advice would you give to parents who are finding themselves in a pretty difficult set of circumstances?
I have never heard of a parent who was unsuccessful with Zig Engelman's book, Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons.
I've
Right?
used that with my own children.
There you
That's
go.
that's a
There you go.
phenomenal book.
And successful, right? Like, there's this idea, and it's a little bit of arrogance on the part of those of us who are in education, to think, well, hey, mom and dad, we're the experts, we're the teachers. You can't do this. Yeah, you can. My caution, however, and this is especially germane now that we're having, for good reasons, this burgeoning science of reading moment. And I cited the work of Emily Hanford a few moments ago, who I think is owed a debt of thanks for kind of ushering it into existence. there is this idea that once you teach kids to quote decode, those 100 easy lessons, I can now read the text, that they now know how to read and the work is done. That's not so. I mean, follow Hirsch's ideas where they lead. You can, and I always use the example from my own classroom. So again, I taught in the lowest performing school in New York City's lowest performing district. I taught fifth grade. In 5 years in that school, 125 total students maybe over those years. I never had a single kid who could not decode. They could all read. In other words, what they struggled with was comprehension. So if people have this idea that just do phonics and all will be well. No, no, no. Phonics is what gets you to the starting line. Now you're a decoder, but you're not a reader yet. And you're not going to be a reader until you have that rich curriculum, until, while we both favor the classical tradition, it doesn't have to be in a classical school, but you do need a rich and varied educational experience. And let's be honest, I mean, well-off families, this almost happens by osmosis, right? If you're a fortunate kid who's growing up in a two-parent household with mom and dad who went to college and are in the professional world and have big vocabularies and engage their kids in rich dinner table conversation, and summers are filled with enrichment, with travel, with ballet and music lessons. You're going to, not for nothing was Hirsch's most famous book called Cultural Literacy. You're growing up awash in the background knowledge and vocabulary that's going to put you in good stead as a reader. The kids that I used to teach, the kids that most teachers, many or most teachers in this country are engaged with in their day-to-day life are what you might think of as school-dependent learners. If they don't get exposed to these things at school, they may not get exposed to them at all, which makes particularly acute the need to give disadvantaged kids, that rich curriculum. So I think I've diverted myself from your question, Winston, which is, what can mom and dad do? My advice is simple. Don't assume you can't do anything. Don't assume that there's some magic about, school and teaching. I happen to be a fan of schools. A lot of folks in, the education ed reform world is almost as if they have an oppositional relationship with schools. I'm not that guy. I like schools just fine. But if the default mode is not working for you, your neighborhood public school, do not assume that you have no options, even if you don't live in a choice-friendly state.
And in light of that too, what are some positive trends that you see today? I mean, I imagine, various states adopting like school choice initiatives, opportunity scholarships, vouchers, and the like.
Yeah.
But what sorts of policy things do you see on a big picture level happening in the country today?
Yeah, right. This is we could have a whole other hour talking about just that. I guess this is the silver lining of COVID. School choice has advanced more in the last 5 years than in the previous 50. We now have, I've lost count, over a dozen states that have universal ESAs or educational savings accounts or tax credit scholarships, some form of school choice mechanism. And by my own calculation, and that of Jason Bedrick of the Heritage Foundation. Once Texas adopted ESAs, as they did a few months ago, you're now talking about a situation where at least half of families in the United States, because states like Texas and Florida are so big, have the ability to opt their kids out of the traditional public school system and educate them privately on public dollars. Like 50%. That's astonishing. And I don't think you can overstate what a dramatic impact that's going to have on schooling in the next several decades. I'm not saying, by the way, I hope this is obvious. I'm not saying 50% of families are educating their kids outside of the traditional public school system, but they now have the ability to do so. So the way I describe this is the relationship that Americans have with this thing called a school is in play to a degree that no one would have believed 10 years ago. I mean, just no one. Or said differently, disruption has finally come for education, just like it has, for travel, for shopping, etc. So fasten your seatbelts. I think the next decade is just going to be absolutely astonishing in terms of the choices that we make to educate our children. And that said, let me speak a little bit of heresy here. I mean, it's kind of a bromide among those of us who are choice advocates to, kind of set ourselves in opposition to the public school system and say, hey, public schools are terrible, choice is good, all will be well if once you have choice. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. Also, I mean, I'm not a public school basher for starters, and also the public school system is not going to go away. I mean, it will continue to be, at the very least, the pluralistic choice, or that's incorrectly said. The majority choice. I mean, it may not be 50% or more. The days, but the days of it being 90%, are over, and that number is only going to go down. But the public school system is not going to go away, and it has to be good. And the answer to failing public schools cannot be now or ever just demand choice, just exit the system. Because, again, at the risk of repeating myself, every kid I've ever taught has been a low-income kid of color, and I don't want to see public schools, particularly large urban schools, become the school of last resort for non-choosers. That's all a preamble to why do I really like choice? Well, because it allows things, frankly, like Thales Academy. It allows, and I know that you don't take public dollars, but I've been saying for a while now, if I were half my age, I'd be moving to an ESA state and opening up a low-cost private school. In the same way that a previous generation of social entrepreneurs launched the charter school networks that we now look at as kind of our guiding lights 25 years later, there's no reason that they can't do the same thing with low-cost private schools in ESA states. And that in turn, as a curriculum and instruction guy, invites a full flowering of different models and curricular models and school culture models. Like, I mean, I've made it clear in this discussion, Winston, that I have some, pretty well-honed ideas about, good, better, and best in terms of curriculum. But that doesn't mean I want to impose them on other people. I want to deliver them really well so that you choose them willingly. But hey, if you want a Montessori school, a project-based learning school, a classical school, a micro school, I don't want to be the guy who says, no, you can't have that. You have to have this instead. So to me, the real promise of choice is that it invites a full flowering of educational opportunities. The analogy I sometimes use is, like, imagine that the public school system that we have now is a restaurant. And what does it serve? Food. Like, okay, well, wait a minute. What if I want Italian or French or Mexican or fusion? No. We just have food here. Well, that's a pretty impoverished view of cuisine, right? So now if we have, in other words, schools, to beat this analogy to death, our education model should be a lot more like restaurants. You should get to choose the flavor that you like, as long as they're all good. And I think you're more likely to get them to be all good when everybody involved is a believer in that particular model. I mean, the last thing I'll say about that, because I'm being tedious here, is my most unorthodox view, back to curriculum and instruction, is that I would rather have my child's teacher be a Kool-Aid swilling devotee of a curriculum that I do not like than to have them do a forced march through core knowledge or something that I do like. So, having back to the school culture piece, having every adult in the child's life being an enthusiastic participant and believing in what they're doing is essential. So, imposing my priors on another school makes no sense whatsoever. I want it to be implemented by people who believe that I believe that this is the best that we can do for kids.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. I've written down a lot of great notes, like little sound bites. Language proficiency is a matter of background knowledge. Hold open as many doors as you can. Hold as many doors open for as long as you can, for as many students as you can. The good, better, and best, touching on every aspect of human endeavor. I mean, it's just been a great conversation, Robert, and I really appreciate your time. Where can people find your work, though? Like if they wanted to look into some of your writing at AEI, what would be the best way for them to find some of the articles that you put out there?
Yeah, every AEI scholar, and I'm kind of smirking as I call myself a scholar, but every AEI fellow or scholar has their own page at the AEI, American Enterprise Institute website that literally everything that we write, publish. This podcast will eventually be there as well. So that's probably one-stop shopping is to just Google my name and American Enterprise Institute, and it will take you right to my scholar page where you, for good or for ill, you'll see all the stuff I'm working on.
Well, that is so good. And is there anything else that we haven't touched on today that you feel like our listeners should know about?
No, I mean it's what we are heading. We alluded to it a moment ago. We are heading into just a remarkable era in American education. You know, it's funny. I've made the analogy, having spent half of my adult life in the news business. It's starting to feel like that, where I've said, you know, because of things like social media and because, you know, of disintermediation and how gatekeeping has kind of fallen by the wayside. On the one hand, there's never been a better time to be a well-educated or well-informed person. You know, in other words, the world is your oyster. You have access to, you know, unparalleled volumes of information, but you got to do the work yourself, you know, because the reliable gatekeepers in the news business have kind of lost interest in that role. It's not that dissimilar in education. The opportunities exist now to become an astonishingly well-educated person, but you might have to do at least some of the work yourself. You know, as a parent, that means finding that correct opportunity, being mindful of curriculum, of school culture. You know, the idea that you could just, you know, put your kid on the yellow bus and the local public school is going to be just fine. Some of them will be, some of them won't be. But you've got to do your homework. You've got to be mindful of, you know, you've got to be an educated consumer of what education is and can be. And if you're that, and if you're vigilant, then yeah, your kid's going to get a great education. But you got to do the work.
Got to do the work. Well, Robert, thank you so much for your time and your expertise and being on Developing Classical Thinkers today. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks, Winston. Me too. Let's do it again soon.
And thank you so much for our listeners at home. If you're interested in Robert's work, we'll include a link to his page on AEI in our show notes. And if you're interested in a unique brand of classical education that we have here at Thales Academy, please be sure to check us out at our website at www.thalesacademy.org. And for Developing Classical Thinkers, I'm Winston Brady. And until next time, stay classy and stay classical.